On the afternoon of the 3rd of September, 1939, a young Englishwoman walked into a public garden in the centre of Munich, sat down on a bench beside a small Greek temple, took a pearl-handled pistol from her bag, and shot herself in the head. The pistol had been a gift from Adolf Hitler. The woman was Unity Mitford, and that morning her own country had declared war on the man she adored. She did not die. She would linger for 9 more years with a German bullet lodged in her brain. And she was only one of 6 sisters. One of those sisters would marry the leader of British fascism in the drawing room of Joseph Goebbels. Another would quietly tell the British government to lock her away. They were raised in the same cold schoolroom. They grew up to divide a century. If you are drawn to the true stories the polite histories leave in the footnotes, subscribe now, because the tale of these 6 sisters only grows stranger from here. Chapter 1. The schoolroom that bred extremes. In a cold upstairs room of an Oxfordshire manor house, 6 girls and 1 boy were raised on a diminishing income, a mother's chilly composure, and a father's roaring temper. And from that single room they would scatter to the furthest ends of the 20th century. The room mattered. It was the schoolroom. And to understand the Mitfords at all, a person has to begin in it, because everything they later became, the fascist and the communist, the prisoner and the duchess, the informer and the girl who shot herself for a dictator, can be traced back to the same drafty house, the same governesses, the same long unstructured days. Their father was David Bertram Ogilvy Freeman Mitford, who became the 2nd Baron Redesdale in 1916, and whom the children called Favre. He was a man of fixed opinions and few books, given to sudden volcanic rages and equally sudden tenderness, a country gentleman who distrusted foreigners, intellectuals, and most of the modern world. Their mother was Sidney Bowles, whom the children called Mauve, the daughter of a magazine proprietor, a cool and self-contained woman who ran the household on theories of health and economy, and who could seem, to her daughters, almost unreachably remote. They had married in February of 1904, and over the following 16 years they produced 7 children. Nancy came first, in 1904. Pamela followed in 1907. Then, at last, the longed-for son, Thomas, always Tom, in 1909. Diana arrived in 1910, Unity in 1914, Jessica in 1917, and Deborah, the last, in 1920. Money was the quiet anxiety beneath the whole enterprise. The Redesdale fortune was never vast, and through the interwar decades it diminished steadily, eaten by taxes, bad luck, and a hopeful scheme or two that never quite paid off. One of those schemes is among the strangest footnotes in the family story. Lord Redesdale owned a gold claim in Canada, near a small mining settlement in northern Ontario that bore the name Swastika, a name the place had carried since long before the symbol acquired its modern horror. The family travelled out to it more than once, and Unity, the 5th child, was conceived during one of those Canadian visits. She was given the middle name Valkyrie. Years later, sitting at the table of the German leader, she would tell him, with apparent delight, that she had been conceived in a town called Swastika. It is the kind of coincidence a novelist would be embarrassed to invent, and it sat at the centre of the family's life like a small dark joke that nobody had yet understood. The houses changed over the years, each move a quiet step down the ladder of grandeur. There had been Batsford, a great pile inherited and soon found to be unaffordable. There was Asthall Manor, beside the River Windrush, a beautiful grey stone house that the children loved and that their father, restless and dissatisfied, decided to sell. And then there was the house he built for them at Swinbrook nearby, a square, practical, charmless building that the daughters privately nicknamed Swinebrook and never warmed to. There was a London house at Rutland Gate for the season, but it was Swinbrook and Asthall before it that formed them, the world of stables and hunters and dogs, of a father who shot and farmed and read one book in his life and saw no need for a second, of a mother forever calculating the housekeeping. The daughters were educated at home, and this fact, more than any other, shaped what they became. Tom was sent away to school, as sons of his class were, and then to study music and law. But the girls were kept at home, taught by a succession of governesses, given lessons in French and riding and the management of a household, and largely left to teach themselves whatever else they craved. Nancy and Jessica, in particular, would burn with resentment about this for the rest of their lives, convinced they had been cheated of the proper education their brother received. Yet the unstructured days had a strange effect. Left to themselves in that schoolroom and the library below it, the cleverer sisters read voraciously and argued endlessly, and in the absence of any outside authority to flatten their differences, each one grew into the most extreme possible version of herself. They built a world of their own to fill the silence. They invented private languages, one called Boodledidge, another called Honnish, dialects so complete that outsiders could not follow them. They gave one another nicknames that stuck for life. They teased with a precision that could draw blood, and they formed and broke alliances across the schoolroom floor. It was a hothouse, sealed and intense, and within it the ordinary frictions of sisterhood acquired an unusual heat. There was real love there, a closeness that would astonish anyone who later watched the family tear itself apart. There was also, from the beginning, the particular cruelty that only people who know one another completely can manage. What no one in that schoolroom could have guessed was how literally the sisters would come to embody the warring ideas of the coming age. Sealed away from the moderating pressures of school and society, raised by a father who admired strength and a mother who admired self-control. The Mitford girls grew up primed to fall in love with certainty, and the 1930s, just over the horizon, would offer certainties in abundance, each more total and more dangerous than the last. It is worth lingering on the father, because Favre became, through Nancy's novels, one of the most famous comic monsters in English fiction, and the truth behind the comedy is stranger than the invention. He genuinely did, by the family's accounts, hunt his own children across the fields with a pack of bloodhounds for sport, the children playing the quarry, the dogs set on their scent, a game that delighted everyone involved. He divided the human race, by his own cheerful admission, into those he approved of and those he called sewers, and the category of sewers was vast, taking in most foreigners, all intellectuals, and a great many of his daughter's friends. He read, it was always said, only one book in his life, a novel he enjoyed so much that he saw no reason ever to risk disappointment by reading a second. He could be terrifying at breakfast and tender by lunch, and he loved his children in his volcanic way, with a completeness that made his later estrangement from several of them all the more painful. The mother's regime was its own kind of eccentricity, cooler and more theoretical. Lady Redesdale held firm convictions about health, declining to trust doctors as fully as most parents did, governing diet and routine by principles of her own devising, running the large household on a careful economy that the dwindling income demanded. The daughters experienced her as remote, an unanswered presence at the centre of their lives, and several of them spent their adult years trying, in letters and memoirs, to understand a woman who had seemed to withhold the warmth they craved. The governesses came and went, few of them lasting long against the combined assault of the schoolroom, so that the girls' education was a patchwork of half-finished subjects and abandoned enthusiasms, thorough in nothing except French, riding, and the arts of teasing. The money worry that ran beneath everything can be put in plain figures, and the figures explain a good deal about the choices the daughters later made. The family had once expected the security of a great inheritance and watched it shrink. Houses were bought and sold at a loss. The grand pile at Batsford proved too costly to keep and was let go. The beloved Asthall was sold against the children's wishes. The purpose-built house at Swinbrook absorbed money and returned little affection. By the time the daughters reached the age of marriage, the brutal truth of their world was simple. They were the daughters of a baron with a famous name, a crumbling income, and no fortune to settle on them, which meant that each girl would have to make her own way by the only currencies available to a woman of her class: beauty, charm, a good marriage, or sheer force of will. It is no accident that the sisters who reached furthest into the world were the ones who possessed those currencies in the largest measure. 6 girls, 1 cold schoolroom, and a century to divide between them. The dividing had not yet begun, but the ground had been prepared in an upstairs room in Oxfordshire by a roaring father and a remote mother and a shrinking fortune, more thoroughly than anyone knew. Chapter 2. 6 girls, 6 futures. By the time they were grown, the sisters had invented a private language and a set of personalities so distinct that, looked at from the far side of everything that happened, they read almost like a deliberate map of the coming age. It is worth pausing on each of them at the threshold of adulthood, before the ideologies arrived to claim them, because the people they would become were already visible in the children they had been. Nancy, the eldest, was the wit. Sharp, quick, and merciless. She had a tongue that could reduce a younger sister to tears in a sentence, and a gift for comedy that she would one day turn into some of the most beloved novels of her century. She had been the first child, the trial run, and she had felt keenly the arrival of each new sibling who diluted her parents' attention. Her humour was armour and weapon at once. Beneath it ran a vein of melancholy and a capacity for longing that her bright surface rarely showed. She would spend much of her life in love with men who could not or would not love her back, and she would turn even that into material. Pamela, the second, was the one the others found hardest to place, which is to say she was the most nearly ordinary, and in that family ordinariness was its own kind of eccentricity. She loved the country, animals, food, and routine. She had none of her sisters' hunger for the spotlight, and none of their appetite for ideology. The poet John Betjeman, who adored her, called her the most rural of the Mitfords. She would marry a brilliant and difficult physicist, divorce him, and spend the second half of her life quietly, sharing a home with an Italian horsewoman, keeping her own counsel while the world wrote and rewrote the legend of her family around her. Then came Tom, the only boy, the still centre the sisters circled. Charming, musical, beloved by all of them, he moved through the family's gathering storms with a diplomat's lightness, somehow remaining on speaking terms with sisters who had stopped speaking to one another. His fate, when it came, would be the one tragedy in the family that no ideology could be blamed for, only the war that the ideologies had helped to bring. Diana, the third daughter, was the beauty, and the word does not quite convey the effect she had on people. Contemporaries described her loveliness as something almost unsettling, a face of such symmetry and serenity that strangers fell silent. She was also clever, cool, and possessed of a will of iron behind the perfect surface. Of all the sisters, she had the most complete confidence, the deepest certainty that the ordinary rules were not written for her. That certainty would carry her into the most notorious marriage of her generation and sustain her through 3.5 years of prison and half a century of public loathing without once cracking. Unity, the fifth child, was the odd one. The giant, awkward, intense girl who never quite fitted the polished family pattern. She was large where her sisters were slender, blunt where they were sly, and prone to fixations that frightened even them. As a girl, she kept a pet rat and a grass snake and took them to parties. She did things for effect, and then, alarmingly, kept doing them after the effect had worn off, as though the performance had become real. In a less extreme family, she might have been merely difficult. In this one, with a dictator newly risen across the sea, her capacity for total devotion would find an object, and the result would be a tragedy without equal among them. Jessica, the sixth, called Decca, was the rebel, and from her early teens she defined herself against everything her family stood for. Where Unity ran toward fascism, Jessica ran toward communism, and she did so with the same totality, the same all-or-nothing temperament that ran through the whole brood. As a girl, she opened a running-away account at the bank and saved toward an escape she fully intended to make. She and Unity, the two extremists, shared a bedroom for years, and they drew a line down the middle of it, one side hung with fascist emblems, the other with communist ones and pictures of Lenin. It was a child's game, until, quite suddenly, it was not. Deborah, the youngest, called Debo, grew up in the shadow of all this drama and chose, with a clear-eyed practicality that the others lacked, not to take part in the ideological civil war at all. She loved the country, like Pamela, and she had ambitions of a thoroughly conventional kind. She once said that every time she sat down to dinner with all her sisters, there was someone present who was not speaking to someone else. She would make the most worldly success of any of them, marrying into one of the greatest houses in England, and she would outlast every one of her siblings, becoming at the end the sole keeper of the whole impossible story. It is worth noticing how early the public appetite for these sisters appeared, because their fame is part of the story and not merely a consequence of it. Even before the politics arrived, the Mitford daughters were newsworthy. The beautiful, witty, well-born girls whose doings filled the society columns, whose marriages and parties and quarrels were followed by readers who had never met them. When the politics did arrive, that existing fame became a megaphone. The press already knew the Mitford name, already had an audience for it, and so every step the sisters took toward the extremes was reported, magnified, and turned into national entertainment. The girl at Hitler's table, the beauty who married a fascist, the debutante who ran off to a communist war, all of it played out in public, before an audience that the sisters' own glamour had assembled in advance. They were, in a sense, among the first families to be famous in the modern way, famous for being themselves, and that fame ensured that their private catastrophes would be lived out as public spectacle, with no possibility of retreat. There they were then, around the schoolroom table. The wit, the countrywoman, the beloved brother, the beauty, the obsessive, the rebel, and the practical youngest. They adored and tormented one another. They finished one another's sentences in languages no one else could speak. And not one of them yet understood that the arguments they were having, half in fun, across that table, were rehearsals for the real divisions to come, divisions that would put one sister in a Nazi inner circle, another in a British prison, and a third in the position of quietly informing on her own blood. The private world they built deserves a closer look because it explains the peculiar intensity of everything that followed. The sisters did not merely tease, they constructed entire systems of teasing, with running jokes that lasted decades and nicknames that buried the real names beneath them. They had their secret tongues, the elaborate boodledidge and the babyish honish, each complete enough to exclude any outsider, including their own parents. They held what they called, only half in fun, a society of the cleverest and most loyal, with rituals and grievances of its own. And they read, constantly and indiscriminately, the older girls devouring the library while the younger ones absorbed whatever the older ones discarded. In a household with no formal schooling to flatten their differences and no outside society to correct their excesses, the sisters became one another's entire universe, and the opinions formed in that sealed chamber acquired the force of religious conviction. That sealed quality is the key to the whole story. A child sent away to school learns, painfully, that her family's certainties are not the world's, that other people see things differently, that she must temper and negotiate and doubt. The Mitford daughters, kept at home, never learned that lesson in the ordinary way. Their certainties were never sanded down by the friction of strangers. So when the great certainties of the age arrived, fascism and communism, each promising a total explanation of the world, the sisters were uniquely unguarded against them. They had been raised to believe absolutely, to commit absolutely, to treat half measures as a kind of cowardice. The ideologies of the 1930s asked for precisely that kind of total belief, and the Mitford sisters, several of them, were ready to give it. The schoolroom years were the last in which all of them belonged wholly to one another. The decade that followed would begin to take them apart. Chapter 3. The Most Beautiful Girl in England. Diana married a Guinness heir at 18 and became, almost overnight, the most photographed and most envied young woman in London society. It was 1929. The groom was Brian Guinness, heir to a share of the colossal brewing fortune, a gentle, literary, deeply devoted young man who could give her everything that the cash-strapped house at Swinbrook could not. To the outside world, it looked like the perfect match, beauty and money, youth and devotion, and for a few years it had every appearance of a fairy tale. The Guinness wealth was on a scale the Mitford daughters had never known. To grasp what Diana married into, consider the contrast. Her father was a baron whose income shrank year by year, who fretted over the cost of the daughter's London season and sold one beloved house after another. The Guinness fortune, by contrast, was among the largest commercial fortunes in the British Isles, built on a brewery whose product was drunk across the world. Diana went, at 18, from a family counting its pennies to a household that need never count at all. There were houses in London and in the country, servants in proper numbers, motor cars, travel, and the easy, unthinking spending of people for whom money had simply never been a question. She took to it with perfect composure, as though she had been waiting all her life for a setting equal to her looks. Her beauty, already remarkable, was now framed by wealth, and the combination made her one of the central ornaments of the bright young things, that glittering, doomed set of 1920s society who gave parties of legendary extravagance and treated the recent slaughter of the Great War as a thing to be danced away. Diana and Brian's house became a gathering place for the most fashionable and the most talented. The painters and writers of the day came to them. The young Evelyn Waugh dedicated a novel to the couple and was, for a time, half in love with Diana himself, as so many were. She bore Brian 2 sons in quick succession. She presided over their houses. She sat for portraits and was photographed for the society papers. By any ordinary measure, she had arrived, at 20, at a destination most women of her world spent a lifetime pursuing, and she had arrived without apparent effort. And yet, beneath the serene surface, something was not still. Those who knew her best detected a restlessness, a faint impatience with the very perfection of her situation. Brian adored her, and his adoration, total and undemanding, seems to have bored her. She was a woman of fierce intelligence and fiercer will, and she had married, at 18, a man who would never challenge her, never refuse her, never present her with anything to overcome. It is one of the recurring patterns in the Mitford story that the sisters were drawn, again and again, not to comfort, but to intensity. The same temperament that would send Unity to Munich and Jessica to Spain stirred in Diana too, though it wore in her the mask of perfect society manners. She did not want to be adored. She wanted to be commanded, or perhaps to find a cause and a man large enough to be worthy of the force she felt in herself. Brian Guinness, kind and rich and besotted, was simply too small a vessel for what Diana was. Into this faint dissatisfaction, in the early 1930s, walked a man who was everything Brian was not. He was older, married, magnetic, ferociously ambitious, and engaged in nothing less than an attempt to remake the politics of Britain. His name was Sir Oswald Mosley, and when Diana met him, she recognized, with the swiftness and certainty that was her hallmark, the cause and the man she had been waiting for. The recognition would cost her the fairy tale, her reputation, and eventually her liberty. She would pay every part of that price without complaint, because she had found, at last, something equal to her will. But that is the next part of the story. For now, hold the image of Diana at the height of her first ascent, 20 years old, impossibly lovely, rich beyond her childhood imagining, photographed and admired and dedicated to, in novels, the most enviable young woman in England. It was the highest point of the conventional life she would ever occupy, and she was about to walk away from all of it. The crowd that envied her in 1930 would, within a few years, be crossing the street to avoid her. The beauty that opened every door would, before the decade ended, be photographed through the bars of a prison van. She did not know that yet. It is worth pausing on the world she was abandoning, because the contrast measures the scale of what she was about to do. The society of the bright young things was the most glamorous and the most reckless that England had seen in living memory. Its parties were the stuff of newspaper legend, themed extravaganzas, treasure hunts across nighttime London, gatherings in swimming baths and on moving trains, a frantic, brittle gaiety that the older generation found scandalous and the participants found necessary, a way of dancing on the grave of the generation the Great War had killed. Diana, with her beauty and her Guinness wealth, stood near the centre of it, and the writers who would define the decade gathered around her. Evelyn Waugh, not yet the great novelist he would become, spent a winter all but living in the young couple's house, and the dedication of one of his early books to Brian and Diana fixed her for a moment as a muse of the age. She had, in short, everything that the daughters of Swinbrook had been raised to want, and rather more besides. Her sisters, still unmarried, still counting pennies under their father's roof, might reasonably have envied her without limit, and yet the very completeness of her good fortune seems to have been the problem. Diana was not built for ease. The same will that her sisters possessed in their different measures ran in her at full strength, disguised by the serene and lovely surface, and a life that asked nothing of that left it with nowhere to go. She did not want to be the most envied young woman in England. She wanted to spend herself on something, and the gilded marriage to Brian Guinness gave her nothing worth spending on. There is a hardness in this that should not be softened. Brian Guinness had done nothing wrong. He was kind, faithful, generous, and devoted, the father of her 2 small sons, and he loved her without reservation. To leave such a man, in that era, for a married fascist agitator, was to commit an act of breathtaking ruthlessness, and Diana committed it with her eyes open and her composure intact. The capacity to do that, to weigh a good and loving husband against the pull of a cause and a man, and to choose the cause without visible regret, is the same capacity that would let her endure prison and exile without bending. It was admirable and chilling at once, and it was entirely Diana. She knew only that she was bored, and that a man had appeared who frightened and excited her in equal measure, and for a Mitford, that combination was always, fatally, irresistible. Chapter 4. The decade that pulled them apart. The 1930s did not invent the Mitfords' extremism, but the decade gave each restless sister an ideology to run toward, and a permission to run that earlier, calmer years would have withheld. To understand how one family produced a guest of Hitler and a soldier of the communist cause, a person has to understand the strange weather of those years, when the settled certainties of the old world seemed to be dissolving, and every clever young person felt forced to choose a side. The Great War had killed a generation and shaken the faith of the survivors. The slump that followed threw millions out of work and made the old governing class look helpless. Across Europe, men with simple, total answers were rising, promising order, pride, and a future. And the democracies, mired in unemployment and doubt, seemed to many young people to offer nothing but managed decline. In that climate, the extremes acquired a glamour that is hard to recover now, knowing what they led to. To be a fascist or a communist in the early 1930s was, for a certain kind of ardent young person, to be on the side of the future against a tired and failing present. The Mitford sisters, raised to certainty and starved of ordinary outlets, were exactly the kind of ardent young people the age was built to capture. Diana moved first, and most consequentially. Her meeting with Sir Oswald Mosley in 1932 was the hinge on which the whole family's fate would turn. Mosley was a former member of Parliament who had sat, in turn, as a Conservative, an Independent, and a member of the Labour government, and who had grown impatient with all of them. In that same year, 1932, he founded the British Union of Fascists, an attempt to import to Britain the mass movement politics he had admired in Italy. He was handsome, commanding, a spellbinding speaker, and utterly convinced of his own destiny. Diana fell in love with the man and the movement together, and once she had fallen, there was no calling her back. She did not merely have an affair. She decided, with her usual cold clarity, to leave her rich and devoted husband and attach herself permanently to a married man and an extremist cause, knowing exactly what it would cost her in the eyes of the world. Unity, watching her adored older sister, was pulled the same way, but further. If Diana loved Mosley and his British movement, Unity would love the original, the German source, and the man at the head of it. She had begun to develop a fascination with Germany and with its new leader, a fascination that in 1932 and 33 was still the stuff of schoolgirl enthusiasm, the wearing of badges, the talking of nonsense at the dinner table. Her father raged, her mother disapproved, and Unity, in the way of the family, simply intensified. What had begun as a younger sister copying an older one was hardening in Unity into something singular and frightening, a private religion with a single living God. And Jessica ran the other way, with equal speed. Where Unity drew swastikas, Jessica read about the Soviet Union and dreamed of revolution. The bedroom the two of them shared, with its line drawn down the middle, fascist emblems on one side and the hammer and sickle on the other, has become the single most quoted image of the family, and rightly, because it captures the whole story in miniature. Two sisters, raised in the same room by the same parents, choosing the two great opposing faiths of their century and decorating their shared wall accordingly. They remained, astonishingly, devoted to each other, even as their politics became murderous abstractions. That devotion, surviving across an unbridgeable ideological gulf, is one of the things that makes the Mitford story more than a curiosity. It is a study in how love and loyalty behave when history drives a wedge through the middle of a family. The parents, caught in the middle, were bewildered and divided. Lord Redesdale, for a time, was sympathetic to Germany and even visited it with his wife and was, briefly, charmed. Lady Redesdale's sympathy ran deeper and lasted longer, a source of lasting pain in the family. When war finally came, it would split the parents from each other as surely as it split the children, the marriage never truly recovering. The household that had seemed, in the schoolroom years, so sealed and complete, was being pulled apart along the same lines that were dividing Europe. And the Mitfords, who did nothing by halves, were living the great quarrel of the age inside one family, at one dinner table, in real time. By the middle of the decade, the positions were set. Diana was bound to Mosley and the British fascist cause. Unity was turning her face wholly toward Germany. Jessica was a committed communist biding her time. Nancy watched it all with a satirist's eye, already storing away the material, her own politics mild and mocking by comparison. Pamela and Deborah kept clear. Tom moved among them all, loved by all. The family stood, in 1934 and 35, at the edge of the events that would define them, each sister poised to make the choice that would carry her to her fate. 6 girls, 1 cold schoolroom, and a century to divide between them. And now, at last, the dividing was about to begin in earnest. It is tempting, looking back, to treat the sisters' choices as a kind of family madness, a peculiar aristocratic eccentricity that has no bearing on the wider world. That would be a comfortable mistake. The truth is that the Mitfords were not eccentric in their politics at all. They were, if anything, representative. A great many people of their class and their country flirted with fascism in the early 1930s, drawn by its promise of order and its hostility to communism. A great many clever young people went the other way, toward the Soviet experiment, convinced that capitalism had failed and that the future lay in Moscow. The British Union of Fascists drew tens of thousands of members at its height. The Communist Party drew its own devoted following among the educated young. The sisters were not freaks swimming against their time. They were swimming hard, with the strongest currents of it, and the only unusual thing about them was that one family contained swimmers heading in opposite directions at once. This is what makes the Mitford story matter beyond its scandal. The sisters were a kind of laboratory in which the great ideological experiment of the century was run inside a single family. Given the same blood, the same upbringing, the same cold schoolroom, what would each of them choose? And why? The answer, when it came, was that the choices had less to do with reason than with temperament and accident. Diana fell in love with a man who happened to be a fascist. Unity fell under the spell of a country and then a leader. Jessica fastened on the opposite faith, partly because her sisters had taken the first. Nancy mocked them all and kept her own counsel. Pamela and Deborah simply declined to play. The ideologies were the objects, but the force behind the choices was the same in all of them. The Mitford hunger for something total to give themselves to, formed in a house where belief had never been tempered by doubt. The historian looking at the family sees, in miniature, the whole tragedy of the interwar years, the way ordinary, well-meaning, intelligent people were drawn toward monstrous causes by needs that had nothing monstrous about them. The need to belong, the need to matter, the need for certainty in an uncertain time. The sisters were not stupid. They were not, most of them, cruel by nature. They were hungry, and the decade fed them poison and called it bread. The scale of the disorder that fed those hungers can be measured. In the depths of the slump, the number of people out of work in Britain climbed to around 3 million, a figure that meant whole towns idled, whole industries silent, and a generation of young men with nothing to do and nowhere to go. The fascist movement that Mosley founded claimed, at its height in the middle of the decade, a membership in the tens of thousands, perhaps 50,000 at its peak, before its violence and its hatreds drove most of them away again. The Communist Party drew its own thousands, concentrated among the educated young and the industrial workers, convinced that the system had failed beyond repair. Across the Channel, the dictatorships commanded the loyalty of tens of millions, and their rallies gathered crowds of a size and fervour that no democracy could match. Against that backdrop of mass unemployment, mass movements, and mass conviction, the choices of 6 sisters in an Oxfordshire manor were not aberrations, but a single family's version of a continent's fever. What the figures cannot capture is the feeling, the sense among the ardent young that history itself had quickened, that the old, slow politics of compromise and committee was finished, and that the future belonged to whoever wanted it most fiercely. The Mitford sisters wanted it fiercely. They had been raised to want things fiercely, in a house where moderation was unknown and belief was never tempered by doubt. The decade did not corrupt them so much as recognize them, calling out to exactly the hunger their upbringing had instilled, and several of them answered the call with the whole of themselves, which was the only way they knew how to answer anything. It would begin in a restaurant in Munich, where a tall English girl had started to come for lunch every day and to wait. Chapter 5. The Girl Who Hunted a Dictator. Unity moved to Munich at 19 with a single goal: to be noticed by the most dangerous man in Europe, and the patience and single-mindedness she brought to that goal would be almost admirable if its object had been anything but what it was. She arrived in 1934, ostensibly to learn German and study art, in truth to engineer a meeting with Adolf Hitler. She had decided, with the totality that ran through every Mitford passion, that she would meet him, befriend him, and become part of his world. And she set about it with the cold method of a hunter who has all the time in the world. She had done her research. She had learned that Hitler, when he was in Munich, frequently took his lunch at a particular restaurant, the Osteria Bavaria, a modest place in the artists' quarter that he favoured. And so Unity began, day after day, to go there too. She would arrive, take a table within his sightline, order something she could afford to nurse, and wait. She did this not for a week or a month, but for many months, through the winter and into the following year, a tall, striking, unmistakably foreign young woman, sitting alone, watching the door. She made no secret of why she was there. She wanted to be seen, wanting to be seen. It is worth dwelling on the strangeness of this, because familiarity has dulled it. A young woman from an English country house sat alone in a foreign restaurant, week after week, month after month, on the single hope that a dictator might one day notice her and invite her over. There was no guarantee it would ever happen. There was every chance she would simply be a curiosity, the odd English girl at the corner table, and then go home, having achieved nothing. But Unity had a quality that her family recognized and feared, an ability to pour the whole of herself into one object until reality bent to her will. And in February of 1935, reality bent. Hitler, who had noticed the persistent English girl and made inquiries about her, sent word inviting her to his table. For Unity, it was the consummation of everything she had wanted, and from that day she became a fixture of his social circle. Over the years that followed, she would meet him many dozens of times, by his own arrangement, recorded in the appointment books that survive. She was invited to the Nuremberg rallies, those vast, terrifying spectacles of light and massed humanity that were designed to overwhelm the individual will, and she found in them not horror, but ecstasy. She was invited to the Bayreuth Festival, to receptions, to private gatherings. She became, to the small circle around the German leader, a familiar presence, the devoted Englishwoman who hung on his words and who would, they joked, have walked into fire at a nod from him. What exactly the relationship was has been argued over ever since, and honesty requires that the arguing be acknowledged rather than resolved. There is no credible evidence that it was a love affair in the physical sense. What the documented record shows is something in some ways stranger, a dictator who tolerated, encouraged, and made use of the adoration of a young foreign aristocrat, and a young woman whose devotion was total, uncritical, and apparently sincere. Hitler found her useful as a symbol, an Englishwoman of good family who worshipped him and his Germany, proof of the appeal of his cause beyond his borders. Unity found in him the absolute object her temperament had always craved. Each used the other, though Unity would never have framed it so, because to her it was not use, but love. Her family looked on with feelings that ranged from amusement to alarm to despair. Her father's early sympathy for Germany curdled as the decade darkened. Her mother's lasted longer. Nancy mocked. Jessica, her communist sister and former bedroom companion, was horrified. And the gulf between the two girls who had drawn a line down their shared room now widened into something no childhood loyalty could bridge. Diana, alone among them, moved in the same world, for Diana too was now travelling to Germany, and the two sisters together formed a small English bridge into the Nazi elite, a bridge that would carry one of them to the most notorious wedding of the age, and the other to a bench in a Munich park with a pistol in her bag. For Unity, the years from 1935 to 1939 were the happiest and the most fatal of her life. To understand how a young woman could do this, a person has to understand a little of what Munich was in those years and what Hitler's circle offered to someone like Unity. Munich was the spiritual home of the movement, the city where it had been born, and in the middle of the 1930s, it was the scene of a regime at the height of its seductive power, before the war revealed the full horror beneath the spectacle. The rallies were engineered by men who understood crowds and light and sound as no propagandists before them, to produce a feeling of belonging so overwhelming that the individual dissolved into the mass. To a lonely, awkward English girl who had never quite fitted anywhere, that feeling of total belonging was not a horror, but a deliverance. She had spent her life as the odd one, too large, too loud, too intense for the polished family pattern. In the ranks of the faithful at Nuremberg, intensity was a virtue, and devotion was the highest good. For the first time, Unity fitted. Her letters home from these years are documents of a chilling ordinariness, the small talk of a girl describing the great events of her social life, except that the social life was conducted at the heart of one of the most evil enterprises in history. She wrote of meetings and meals and outings as another girl might write of dances and house parties. She recorded the kindnesses of the man she adored, the little attentions, the conversations, with the breathless pride of a favourite. And woven through the same letters were sentiments about the regime's enemies, about the people it persecuted, that show how completely she had absorbed its hatreds. She was given the use of a flat in Munich, and it was understood that the flat had belonged to a Jewish family driven from it by the regime's persecutions, and Unity, recording the convenience of her new home, betrayed no flicker of conscience about how it had been made available. The banality of her cruelty is in some ways the most disturbing thing about her, the way the horror sat comfortably alongside the chatter, in the same girl, in the same letters, without apparent friction. Her family at home received these letters with deepening dismay, and they were not alone, for Unity had become, by the late 1930s, a public figure of a notorious kind. The British press had discovered her, the aristocratic English girl at Hitler's side, and her doings were reported with a mixture of fascination and disgust. She gave interviews. She wrote, on one occasion, a letter to a German publication, an outburst so extreme in its hatreds that it caused a scandal when it became known in England. She had become, in the eyes of her countrymen, something between a joke and a traitor, a figure of ridicule who was also, increasingly, an object of real anger as the threat from Germany grew. And still she did not waver. The disapproval of England only confirmed her in her devotion. She had found her place, and her place was at the dictator's table, and she would not give it up for the opinion of a country she felt had never understood her. The deeper one looks into Unity's years in Germany, the harder it becomes to hold on to any single judgment of her. She was a perpetrator, in the sense that she lent her name, her enthusiasm, and her aristocratic respectability to a regime of mass murder, and recorded its cruelties without protest. She was also, unmistakably, a casualty, a young woman of fragile and obsessive temperament who had been captured, body and soul, by the most powerful machine of seduction ever built, and who had nothing in her upbringing to arm her against it. Both things are true. The girl who hunted a dictator across a continent was both a willing servant of evil and a kind of victim of it. And the tragedy of her story is that those two things were, in her, the same thing. She had what she wanted. She was inside the circle, recognized, welcomed, attended to by the man she worshipped. She wore the party badge. She gave the salute. She spoke of him in terms that embarrassed even committed admirers. And all the while, beneath the rallies and the receptions, the machinery she adored was building toward the war that would force her at last to choose between her country and her God. She could not imagine making that choice. When it came, she would not make it. She would try, instead, to step out of the world altogether. But that lay a few years off. For now, she sat at the dictator's table, a Mitford who had hunted her quarry across a continent and caught it, not yet understanding that the thing she had caught would destroy her. Chapter 6. The Wedding in the Propaganda Minister's House. On the 6th of October, 1936, Diana married Britain's leading fascist in a Berlin drawing room, with Adolf Hitler among the guests, and the location and the witnesses tell the whole story of how far she had travelled from the gilded life she had abandoned. The drawing room belonged to Joseph Goebbels, the German propaganda minister, one of the principal architects of the Nazi state's machinery of lies. The marriage was kept secret, and the guest of honour was the dictator himself, who gave the couple, as a wedding present, a signed photograph of himself in a heavy silver frame. To reach that drawing room, Diana had given up almost everything the world counted as valuable. She had left Brian Guinness, the gentle, adoring, immensely rich husband of her youth, and the comfortable certainties of her first marriage. The divorce came through in 1934. In leaving him, she forfeited not only the Guinness fortune, but the approval of society. For to abandon a good husband for a married fascist agitator was, by the standards of her world, an unforgivable scandal. Doors that had opened to the most beautiful girl in England now closed. Friends fell away. Her own family was divided and dismayed. And Diana, with the iron calm that never deserted her, accepted all of it as the price of being where she wished to be, beside Sir Oswald Mosley and his cause. Mosley was, by this point, the head of the British Union of Fascists, the black-shirted movement he had founded in 1932 in imitation of the Continental Originals. He was married when he and Diana began their affair, and his first wife, Cynthia, died in 1933, leaving him free, though he was in no hurry to remarry, and Diana spent years as his acknowledged mistress before becoming his wife. The movement he led had its moment of menace in the middle of the decade, with its uniformed marches, its rallies, its street confrontations, and its ugly turn toward the open anti-Jewish politics of its German model. Diana was no mere bystander to this. She was Mosley's closest confidant and his most devoted supporter, and she travelled repeatedly to Germany, partly out of conviction and partly to pursue a scheme, dear to Mosley, of securing German backing for a commercial radio station that would fund the British movement. It was in the course of these trips, moving in the highest Nazi circles alongside her sister Unity, that her friendship with Hitler and the Goebbels household was formed. The secret wedding in October 1936 was the symbol of that intimacy. Only a handful of people were present, Unity among them, along with Mosley's witnesses. The ceremony took place in Goebbels' house. Hitler attended. The whole event was kept hidden from the British public and even from much of Diana's own family, because Mosley judged, correctly, that the revelation of his German wedding would be politically damaging at home. The marriage was not made public until many months later, after the birth of the couple's first son. The photograph of the dictator in its silver frame went home with them to England, a wedding present that would, a few years on, look less like a memento and more like an exhibit. The deeper question that hangs over Diana's life is how a woman of such intelligence could give herself so completely to such a cause, and remain, to the end of her long life, unrepentant. The honest answer is that her loyalty was, at bottom, personal as much as political. She loved Mosley with a devotion as total as Unity's love for Hitler, and his cause was hers because it was his. She had also, like many of her class and time, allowed herself to be persuaded that the dictators were the bulwark against communism, that the real enemy was the Soviet system her sister Jessica adored, and that the ugliness of the Nazi project was either exaggerated by its enemies or a regrettable detail. These were the comfortable evasions of a great many people in the 1930s, and Diana, who was nobody's fool, embraced them with a clear-eyed willingness that makes her harder to excuse than the merely deceived. There is a photograph, often reproduced, of the two beautiful Mitford sisters, Diana and Unity, in Germany in those years, smiling, at ease, at the very heart of one of the most evil regimes in history. It is an image that has lost none of its power to unsettle, because the women in it are so obviously of the English upper class, so recognizably the products of that country schoolroom, and so entirely comfortable in surroundings that ought to have appalled them. That comfort, that ease, is the scandal at the center of Diana's story. She married Mosley in Goebbels' drawing room with Hitler looking on, and she went home to England with the dictator's photograph under her arm, and she never, across 60 more years of life, expressed a word of genuine regret. The man for whom she gave up everything deserves to be understood, because Diana's tragedy is inseparable from his nature. Sir Oswald Mosley was, by common consent, one of the most gifted political figures of his generation, and one of the most disastrous. He had begun with every advantage, a baronetcy, a brilliant early career, a seat in Parliament won young, and the reputation of a coming man who might one day lead the country. He had served in 3 different political camps and exhausted his patience with all of them, convinced that the parliamentary system was too feeble to meet the crisis of the age. His answer was to build a movement outside it, modelled on the dictatorships he admired, with himself at its head, uniformed followers, mass rallies, and a creed of national renewal that curdled, as the decade went on, into the open, anti-Jewish hatred of its continental models. He was a spellbinding speaker, vain, ruthless, and serially unfaithful, a man who commanded devotion and betrayed it in equal measure. Diana knew all of this and loved him anyway, with a loyalty that outlasted his infidelities, his failures, and his disgrace. The movement reached its ugliest pitch in the middle of the decade. There were the marches through districts chosen to provoke, the street battles with those who opposed them, the rallies that ended in violence. There was a notorious gathering at a great London hall at which stewards beat hecklers with a brutality that turned much of respectable opinion against the movement for good. And there was the steady drift toward the persecution of Jews as the organizing principle of the whole enterprise. A drift that Diana, traveling between London and Berlin, moving in Hitler's circle, did nothing to resist and much to encourage. She was not a passive ornament to her husband's politics. She was his closest confidant, his link to the German leadership, and an enthusiast for the scheme, dear to them both, of securing secret German money to fund a commercial radio venture whose profits would bankroll the British movement. That scheme, pursued through her German connections, would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence against her. It is the radio scheme, more than the rallies or the rhetoric, that explains why the British state would come to regard Diana as so dangerous. A woman who merely held repellent opinions might be despised, but left alone. A woman who travelled repeatedly to Nazi Germany, who moved in the highest circles of the enemy regime, who was secretly married in the propaganda minister's house with the dictator present, and who was actively seeking enemy funding for a political operation at home, was something else entirely. She was, in the cold assessment of the security service, a channel between British fascism and the German state, and in time of war, such a channel could not be permitted to remain open. Diana had made herself, through her own convictions and her own actions, exactly the kind of person the wartime emergency powers were designed to confine. The bill for that ease would come due in the summer of 1940, when the country she had taken so lightly went to war, and decided that the beautiful Lady Mosley was too dangerous to leave at liberty. Chapter 7. The Runaway and the Cause. While two sisters drifted toward Berlin, a third ran in the opposite direction, eloping to a war, and Jessica's flight is the proof that the Mitford temperament was not, in itself, fascist. It was extremist. It craved totality, certainty, and a cause worth burning for. And in Jessica that same craving fastened not on Hitler, but on his sworn enemies. From her early teens, she had been a communist in the privacy of her own heart, saving toward an escape, reading what she could, defining herself against the family that surrounded her. What she needed was an occasion and an ally, and in the person of a distant cousin, she found both. His name was Esmond Romilly, and his connection to the family was striking, for he was a nephew by marriage of Winston Churchill, the son of Churchill's wife's sister. He was also, like Jessica, a young communist and a fierce anti-fascist, a rebel against his own privileged background, who had already run away from school, edited an anti-establishment magazine, and gone to fight against fascism in Spain, where civil war had broken out in 1936. To Jessica, he was the embodiment of everything she dreamed of becoming: brave, committed, contemptuous of the comfortable world that had raised them both. When the two cousins met properly in early 1937, the attraction was immediate and the plan was swift. They eloped. In February of 1937, they slipped out of England and made their way towards Spain, where Esmond intended to return to the anti-fascist fight and where Jessica intended to share whatever came. The flight caused a sensation. Here was another Mitford daughter, sister to the famous fascist beauties, running off to the communist side of the very conflict that was tearing Europe in two. The symmetry was almost unbearable. The same family that had a daughter at Hitler's table now had a daughter bound for the Spanish front on the side of his enemies. And the British press, which had already discovered that the Mitford sisters were endlessly newsworthy, fell upon the story. Her family's response revealed how seriously they took it. Lord Redesdale was beside himself. Efforts were made to bring the runaways back. At one point, the British authorities became involved, and a naval vessel was reportedly drawn into the effort to locate the couple. So determined was the family to retrieve its errant daughter from a war zone and from a young man they regarded as entirely unsuitable. The pursuit failed. Jessica was of an age and a determination that no amount of family pressure could overcome, and she had in Esmond an ally as stubborn as herself. They married in the spring of 1937 in a civil ceremony near the Spanish border, and the family was forced, with whatever grace it could muster, to accept the marriage it had been unable to prevent. The two of them threw themselves into the radical life. They lived hand to mouth, they worked for the cause, and they treated poverty as a badge of honor, a deliberate rejection of the cushioned existence they had both been born to. For Jessica, it was a liberation. She had escaped the schoolroom, the family, the suffocating certainties of her class, and she had done it on her own terms, with a man who shared her every conviction. The girl who had drawn the communist half of the bedroom wall had made the picture real, and the gulf between her and her fascist sisters, unity above all, was now complete. The line drawn down the middle of a childhood bedroom had become a frontier with a war running along it. There would be more upheaval ahead for Jessica. The couple eventually made their way to the United States, drawn by the promise of a new world without the old hierarchies, and it was there that the next phase of her life would unfold. And there would be tragedy, for Esmond, the brave anti-fascist cousin of Churchill, would not survive the war that was coming. But in the late 1930s, before the losses arrived, Jessica stood as the living counterweight to her sisters, the Mitford, who had taken the family's gift for total commitment and given it to the opposite side. That she could do so, and still love unity, still grieve the family's fractures, still feel the pull of the schoolroom, is part of what makes her story so affecting. The Spanish adventure itself deserves more than a passing mention, because it reveals the seriousness beneath what the newspapers treated as a runaway romance. The Spanish Civil War was, for the committed young of the 1930s, the great cause of the age, the place where the abstract battle between fascism and its enemies became a real war with real dead. Idealistic young people from across Europe and beyond travelled to Spain to fight for the Republic against the fascist-backed forces, many of them never to return. Esmond Romilly had already been one of them, having gone out to fight and survived, and his decision to return, with Jessica at his side, placed the couple squarely in the path of real danger. This was not a lark. It was a deliberate choice to put themselves on the front line of the very conflict that was rehearsing the World War to come, on the opposite side from everything Diana and Unity had embraced. The symmetry within the family was now complete and almost unbearable in its neatness. One sister moved in the circle of the man whose ideology was arming one side of the Spanish War. Another sister ran off to serve the other side. The line that two little girls had drawn down the middle of a shared bedroom, fascist emblems on one wall and communist on the other, had become a real frontier with real blood running along it. And the two sisters who had drawn it were now, in effect, enlisted on opposing sides of the same global struggle. No novelist would dare invent it. The Mitfords lived it, as a family, in real time, and the British public, devouring the newspapers, could hardly believe its luck at the spectacle. The pursuit of the runaways became, briefly, a national drama. Lord Redesdale, frantic, pulled every string he could reach to bring his daughter home from a war zone and away from a young man he regarded as a dangerous radical and an unsuitable match. There were appeals to the authorities, and the machinery of the British state was reportedly drawn into the effort to locate the couple. An early instance of the family's private dramas becoming matters of official concern, a pattern that would recur far more gravely in the war to come. The pursuit failed. Jessica was of age, or near enough, and immovable, and Esmond was as stubborn as she. They married, and the family was forced to accept what it could not prevent, swallowing its objections and recognizing, with whatever grace it could find, the marriage of the communist daughter to the communist cousin of Winston Churchill. Jessica's rebellion had not come from nowhere, and it is worth tracing its roots, because they lay in the same soil that produced her sister's opposite extremes. From childhood, she had felt herself a misfit in the family's world, repelled by its assumptions, its complacency, its certainties about rank and money and the natural order of things. While her sisters absorbed those assumptions or rebelled toward other certainties, Jessica turned against the whole edifice, and she did so with the family's characteristic thoroughness. As a girl, she had opened what she called a running away account at a bank, putting aside small sums toward an escape she was entirely serious about making. She read what she could find about socialism and revolution. She defined herself, year by year, against everything Swinbrook stood for, and she waited, with a patience that matched Unity's vigil in the Munich restaurant, for the means of escape to present itself. When Esmond appeared, brave and committed and contemptuous of the comfortable world, he was not the cause of her rebellion, but its long-awaited instrument. There is a deep irony in the fact that the two sisters who hated each other's politics most completely, Unity and Jessica, were in temperament the most alike, the two purest expressions of the family's all-or-nothing nature. Each fixed upon a total faith, each pursued it with single-minded patience, each ran to the furthest extreme her world offered and gave herself to it without reservation. That they ran in opposite directions was almost an accident of which idea reached them first, and which sister had taken the other path before them. Had the timing been different, one cannot help wondering, might the destinations have been reversed? It is an unanswerable question, but the very fact that it can be asked tells you something true about the Mitfords, that their convictions, fierce as they were, grew less from reason than from a shared and restless hunger that the age stood ready to fill with whatever was nearest to hand. What is most striking, across all of this, is that the love between the sisters did not die. Jessica, the communist, and Unity, the fascist, the two who had shared the divided bedroom, remained, in some deep and stubborn way, attached to each other, even as their beliefs became murderous opposites. The bond formed in the schoolroom proved more durable than the ideologies that should, by every logic, have destroyed it. The sisters had divided the century between them, but the love that had been forged in that cold upstairs room refused, even now, to die cleanly. It would survive even the things they were about to do to one another, and the first of those things was very close. Chapter 8. Inside the circle, as the clock ran down. For 4.5 years, Unity moved through Hitler's private world, at the rallies, at Bayreuth, at his table, as Europe slid steadily toward the war that would force upon her a choice she could not survive. The years from 1935 to 1939 were, for her, a kind of long intoxication, and the documented record of them is a study in the slow approach of a catastrophe that everyone but Unity seemed able to see coming. She was deeper inside the regime than any other British civilian of her standing, and she had made herself a creature of it so completely that when the moment of decision arrived, there was almost nothing of her left that stood apart. The texture of those years can be reconstructed from her own letters and from the recollections of those around the German leader. She attended the enormous Nuremberg rallies and described them in tones of rapture. She was given a flat in Munich, taken, it was said, from a Jewish family forced out under the regime's persecutions, a detail that lodges in the memory because Unity recorded no flicker of conscience about it. She wore her party badge with pride. She involved herself in the regime's anti-Jewish politics to a degree that horrified those at home who still hoped she was merely a foolish girl playing at extremism. She had passed, by the late 1930s, well beyond play. She believed, fully and without reservation, in the man and the cause she served. And yet she remained, maddeningly, an English girl, a daughter of Swinbrook, a Mitford. She wrote home. She missed her family. She returned to England between her German sojourns and slipped back into the old life, the dogs, the sisters, the country, before going out again to Munich and the dictator's table. She lived, in other words, astride a fault line that was steadily widening, 1 foot in the England that had made her and 1 in the Germany she had chosen. And she seems never to have allowed herself to confront the obvious truth that the two were heading toward each other with the force of a collision, and that when they met, she would be torn in half. It was during these years that the pistol entered the story. Hitler, it is recorded, gave Unity a small pearl-handled pistol for her own protection, a gift whose significance no one could then have guessed. She kept it. It was, in a sense, the most intimate token of the strange bond between them, a weapon placed in the hand of a devotee by the object of her devotion. She would carry it, and in the end, she would turn it on herself, and the bullet from it would stay in her brain for the rest of her shortened life, so that she carried his gift inside her skull to the grave. Few objects in any family's history have carried so much dreadful meaning. It runs through the rest of her story like a dark thread, the dictator's pistol, given in friendship, used in despair, lodged in the brain, fatal at last, after 9 slow years. The family, meanwhile, was coming apart under the strain of what its daughters had become. Jessica was gone, married to her communist cousin and bound for America. Diana was Lady Mosley, secretly wed in Goebbels' drawing room, devoted to the British fascist cause. Unity was inside the German circle. Nancy watched and mocked, and quietly grew more hostile to the politics her sisters had embraced. The parents were divided, the father's enthusiasm for Germany dying as the mother's persisted, the marriage cracking under the weight of it. Tom, the beloved brother, moved among them all, somehow keeping the peace, though even his diplomacy could not close the chasms that had opened. The sealed, complete world of the schoolroom was gone, replaced by a family that could not all sit at one table without someone refusing to speak. Then, in the summer of 1939, the clock that had been running down all decade reached its final hour. The crisis over Poland deepened. The diplomatic efforts failed. It became clear, even to those who had refused to see it, that Britain and Germany were going to war, and that the two halves of Unity's world were about to become open enemies. For Unity, this was not a political development, but a personal apocalypse. The country of her birth and the man of her worship were going to try to destroy each other, and she would be expected to choose a side, and she could not. She had said, to more than one person, that she would not be able to bear it, that if war came between England and Germany, she would kill herself. Those around her took it, perhaps, for the kind of dramatic declaration she was prone to. It was not. The warnings that Unity would not survive a war between her two worlds were not subtle, and in hindsight, they read like a slow building drumbeat that everyone heard and no one knew how to stop. She had said it plainly, to more than one person, that she could not bear to live if England and Germany went to war, that she would end her own life rather than witness it. Those who loved her, and even those who merely knew her, took these declarations for the kind of extravagant talk that Unity had always been prone to, the dramatic statement made for effect. But Unity had spent her whole life turning extravagant statements into committed action. She had said she would meet Hitler, and she had met him. She had said she would belong to his world, and she had belonged to it. There was no reason, except wishful thinking, to assume that this latest vow was any less sincere than the others, and it was not. Through the tense summer of 1939, as the diplomatic situation darkened and the likelihood of war grew, Unity moved through her German life under a gathering shadow. The man she worshipped was steering the continent toward the catastrophe she dreaded. The country of her birth was hardening against the country of her devotion. Every newspaper, every wireless bulletin brought the collision closer, and Unity, caught between the two, seems to have understood, with a clarity she rarely showed about anything else, that there would be no place for her in the world the war would make. She could not be English in Hitler's Germany once the war began. She could not be Hitler's devotee in England. The two halves of her identity, which she had managed to keep precariously balanced for years, were about to become mutually exclusive, and she could not give up either one. The arithmetic of her position was, quite literally, unbearable. To choose England was to betray the man and the cause that had given her, for the first time in her life, a sense of belonging. To choose Germany was to become a traitor to her own country and her own family, fully and openly, in time of war. There was no third option that her temperament could accept, no possibility of compromise, of muddling through, of waiting to see. For a person built to believe absolutely, the demand to choose between two absolute loyalties was not a difficult decision, but an impossible one. And the only way she could see out of an impossible choice was to remove herself from the board entirely. She had decided, it seems, well before the event, that if war came, she would not live to see it through, and she made, in the final days of peace, the quiet preparations of someone settling her affairs. On the 1st of September, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland. On the 3rd, Britain declared war, and Unity Mitford, in Munich, made her preparations to keep the promise she had made. The point of no return had been reached, not just for her, but for the whole nation, and for the family that had divided the century between them. What came next would test every bond among the six sisters to its breaking point, and beyond. Chapter 9. A gunshot in the English Garden. The day Britain declared war, Unity kept the promise she had made to herself and walked into the Englischer Garten with the dictator's pistol in her bag. It was Sunday, the 3rd of September, 1939. That morning in London, the Prime Minister had announced over the wireless that the country was at war with Germany. In Munich, Unity Mitford understood that the two halves of her world had finally collided, and that the thing she had always said she could not bear had come to pass. She had, in the preceding days, put her affairs in a strange kind of order. She had handed over certain possessions. She had written notes. And then, on that Sunday afternoon, she walked into the great public park in the centre of the city, the Englischer Garten, found a quiet spot near a small classical temple, sat down, took out the pearl-handled pistol Hitler had given her, raised it to her right temple, and fired. She did not die. The bullet entered her skull and lodged deep within her brain, in a place too dangerous for any surgeon of the day to reach, but it did not kill her. She was found, alive and grievously injured, and taken to a clinic in Munich. The news made its way by degrees to the man whose gift she had used and whose war had driven her to it. Hitler, informed that his devoted Englishwoman had shot herself on the day her country declared war on his, responded with a solicitude that has its own grim fascination. He arranged for her to receive the best care available. He visited, or sent word. He paid the costs of her treatment. And he made arrangements, as her condition slowly stabilized, for her eventual return to her family in England, an extraordinary gesture toward a citizen of a country with which he was now at war. For weeks, she hovered between worlds in the Munich clinic, and the family in England, receiving fragmentary and alarming reports, could do nothing but wait. Communication between the warring countries was difficult and slow. The Mitfords knew only that Unity had shot herself, that she was alive, and that she was in the hands of the enemy regime she had adored. It was a peculiarly cruel suspense to have a daughter and sister gravely wounded by her own hand in the capital of the enemy, beyond reach, her fate dependent on the goodwill of the very man whose cause had ruined her. In time, as her condition allowed, the arrangements Hitler had set in motion bore their strange fruit. Unity was moved, late in 1939, to a clinic in Switzerland, which, being neutral, could serve as the bridge between the warring nations. And there, at the beginning of 1940, her mother and one of her sisters travelled to collect her and bring her home. What they found was not the Unity who had left. The girl who came back to England in January of 1940 was physically and mentally shattered. The bullet in her brain had done terrible damage. She was incontinent, her speech and memory impaired, her personality altered, her mind regressed, by the family's own account, to something like that of a young child. The tall, fierce, frightening girl who had hunted a dictator across a continent had been reduced to a helpless invalid who would need to be cared for, like an infant, for whatever years remained to her. The homecoming, when it came, was a public spectacle of a painful kind. The press had not forgotten that this was the Mitford girl who worshipped Hitler, and her return through the port on the south coast of England, broken and bandaged, was news. There was little public sympathy. To a country newly at war with Germany, Unity Mitford was not a tragic young woman, but a traitor who had taken the enemy's side and shot herself for grief at her own country's resistance. The family closed around her as best it could, but there was no hiding the scale of the catastrophe, nor the shame that attached to it. So ended the active life of the most extreme of the sisters, not in a grand gesture that the world would honour, but in a slow ruin that the world would mostly despise. She had wanted, above all things, to belong to Hitler's world, and when that world went to war with her own, she had tried to leave both worlds at once, and had failed even at that, surviving as a kind of living ghost of herself. The pistol's bullet remained in her brain, ticking, a slow fuse with 9 years still to burn. The journey home itself was an extraordinary thing, a small drama of mercy conducted across the front lines of a new war. With Unity's condition stabilized enough to permit travel, the arrangements set in motion by Hitler bore their strange fruit. She was moved, by stages, from Munich toward the neutral ground of Switzerland, the only bridge across which a citizen of one warring nation could be passed to the other. There, at the turn of the year, her mother and her youngest sister Deborah travelled out to meet her and bring her home. The Deborah who made that journey was a young woman barely out of girlhood, and the sight that met her in the Swiss clinic was one she would carry for the rest of her long life, the fierce, formidable sister of the schoolroom, reduced to a damaged, dependent stranger who did not always know those around her. The homecoming through the south coast port was a public ordeal layered on a private catastrophe. The press was waiting. The story of the Hitler-worshipping Mitford girl who had shot herself was irresistible, and her arrival, frail and bandaged and helped along by her family, was photographed and reported with little tenderness. To a nation that had just gone to war with Germany and was steeling itself for the ordeal ahead, Unity Mitford was not an object of pity, but a symbol of treachery. The aristocrat who had taken the enemy's side and could not even bear the consequences of her own choice. There were questions asked in official circles about whether she represented a security risk, whether the woman who had been so close to the German leadership should be allowed to move freely. In the end, her shattered condition answered the question. There was nothing left of the dangerous Unity to fear. There was only the wreckage to care for. For the family, the return of the broken Unity opened a wound that would never close. Here was the proof, in the flesh, of where the decades' passions had led. The girl who had run furthest toward the new faith had been destroyed by it, and the destruction was not clean or final, but slow and daily, a living reminder in the heart of the family of everything that had gone wrong. And there was no respite in it, no resolution, only the long, grinding work of caring for someone who could not care for herself in a country that despised her, while the war her chosen cause had unleashed ground on. And while the broken Unity was being settled into her family's care, another crisis was breaking over a second sister. For the British state, now at war and afraid of enemies within, had begun to take a hard look at the beautiful Lady Mosley and at her sister Diana. The question of what to do would soon be answered in a way that no Mitford had foreseen. The answer would come, in part, from inside the family itself. Chapter 10. The Sister Who Informed. In June of 1940, with one sister broken in body and mind, the eldest sister sat down and quietly told the British government that another sister was a danger, and the act she committed in that month is the darkest and most painful thread in the whole tangled story. The country was in mortal peril. France was falling. The German army stood on the Channel coast, and invasion seemed not merely possible, but imminent. In that atmosphere of genuine terror, the British state turned its attention to the enemy within, to the fascists and Nazi sympathizers who might, in the event of invasion, form a fifth column to aid the conqueror. And no British fascists were more prominent or more obviously connected to the German leadership than Sir Oswald Mosley and his wife Diana, who had married in Goebbels' drawing room with Hitler as a guest. It was at this moment that Nancy Mitford, the eldest of the six, the wit and the novelist, made her choice. She went to the authorities, and she told them what she believed about her sister Diana. She told them that Diana was a dangerous fascist, that she had travelled repeatedly to Germany, that she was, in Nancy's assessment, more committed and more dangerous than even her husband, and that she should not be left at liberty in a country fighting for its life. The intelligence assessment that resulted, later released into the public record, described Lady Mosley as reported on what it called the best authority, that of her own family and intimate circle, to be a public danger, and as being far cleverer and more dangerous than her husband. That best authority, the family member who supplied the damning judgment, was Nancy. The motives behind Nancy's act have been debated ever since, and they resist any single, simple explanation. There was, certainly, genuine conviction. Nancy was no fascist. She found her sister's politics repellent, and in the summer of 1940, with the nation in peril, she may well have believed, sincerely, that Diana truly was a danger who ought to be confined. Patriotism, in that desperate season, drove many people to inform on neighbours and even relatives. But there was, almost certainly, more to it than pure principle. The relationship between Nancy and Diana had always carried a charge of rivalry and resentment beneath its affectionate surface. Nancy, the clever, sharp, less beautiful eldest sister, had spent her life in the shadow of Diana's loveliness and Diana's serene self-assurance. The chance to act against her, cloaked in the unimpeachable language of national duty, may have answered impulses that ran deeper and darker than patriotism alone. Whatever the mixture of motives, the consequences were grave and concrete. Nancy's testimony did not act alone, for the state had its own abundant reasons to distrust the Mosleys. But her words, coming from inside the family, from a sister, carried a particular weight. The judgment of someone who had known Diana all her life, who could speak to her character and her convictions from the closest possible vantage, was exactly the kind of evidence the authorities valued. It strengthened the case against Diana materially, and it helped ensure that when Diana was detained, she would remain detained, without trial, for years. And here lies the cruelest part of the whole episode. Nancy never told Diana what she had done. For the rest of Nancy's life, more than 30 years, the two sisters remained on outwardly affectionate terms. They wrote to each other. They visited. They teased and gossiped in the old Mitford way. They both lived eventually in France, within reach of each other, and maintained the appearance of sisterly closeness. And throughout all those decades, Nancy carried the secret of what she had said to the British government in the summer of 1940, and Diana did not know. Diana believed, for most of her life, that she had been imprisoned by the impersonal machinery of the state. She did not know that her own eldest sister had been among those who put her there. The truth would emerge only later from the released records, when both the sisters concerned were near the end or beyond it. It is one thing for a family to be divided by politics. It is another for one member to inform on another to the secret apparatus of the state, and then to maintain, for 3 decades, a loving pretense over the act. Nancy did both. She turned her family's tragedy into comic novels that the world adored, and she kept, beneath the comedy, this one unfunny secret. The phrase in the title, that one sister sold the others to the authorities, compresses and sharpens what happened, but it does not invent it. It is worth being precise about what is known and what is inferred, because the charge is a grave one, and the family's reputation has been argued over for decades. What the released records show is that the security service held an assessment of Diana describing her on the authority of someone within her own family and intimate circle as a public danger and as more dangerous than her husband. What biographers have established, from Nancy's own correspondence and from the wider record, is that Nancy approached officials in the summer of 1940 and gave a damning account of her sister's activities and convictions. The exact channel through which she did this, whether her words went first to the security service itself or to another official who passed them on, is the one genuinely uncertain element, and it is the reason the blunt phrase about selling her sisters to the security apparatus should be understood as a sharpening of the truth, rather than a precise transcript of it. The substance that Nancy informed on Diana and that her information counted against her is not in serious doubt. What gives the episode its peculiar horror is the long performance that followed. This was not a single act committed in the heat of a national emergency and then regretted. It was a secret kept and maintained across more than 3 decades, through thousands of affectionate letters, through visits and holidays and shared confidences, through the whole elaborate machinery of sisterly love that the Mitfords were so good at. Nancy and Diana grew old in the same country. They saw each other. They wrote to each other in the teasing private idiom of the schoolroom. And all the while Nancy held, behind her bright and witty surface, the knowledge of what she had done to her sister in 1940, and Diana, trusting and unsuspecting, did not know. To deceive a stranger is one thing. To deceive a sister, daily, for 30 years, about the very thing that had cost her her liberty, is a feat of concealment that is hard to contemplate without a shiver. And yet, it would be too simple to cast Nancy as a straightforward villain. She was, in 1940, a patriotic Englishwoman in a country facing invasion, watching a sister who had married the leader of British fascism in the house of a Nazi minister, with the dictator present. To believe such a sister genuinely dangerous required no malice, only eyes. The tragedy is not that Nancy lied about a danger that did not exist, but that the danger may well have been real, and that she chose to act on it against her own blood, and then could not bring herself to confess it. The substance is documented. A Mitford sister gave the British state the assessment that helped imprison another Mitford sister, and said nothing of it for the rest of her life. And the sister she helped to imprison was about to be arrested 11 weeks after giving birth and taken to a cell in Holloway prison. Chapter 11. Prisoner without a trial. 11 weeks after giving birth to her fourth son, Diana was arrested at her home and taken to a cell in Holloway prison, held without charge and without trial under the wartime emergency powers, and her 3.5 years behind those walls form the centre of her legend and the literal truth behind the second clause of the title. The power that confined her was Defence Regulation 18B, a provision that allowed the British government, in the emergency of war, to detain without trial those it judged a threat to national security. It was a drastic measure, a suspension of the ancient right not to be imprisoned without due process, justified by the genuine peril of the moment. Under it, Sir Oswald Mosley had been arrested in May of 1940, and on the 29th of June, 1940, the state came for Diana. The timing was merciless. She had given birth to her youngest son, Max, only weeks before. She was nursing an infant, and she was taken from her home and her children and conveyed to Holloway, the women's prison in North London, and placed in a cell. She was not told how long she would be held. She was not tried. She was not convicted of any crime. She was detained because the state, advised by its security service and informed in part by her own sister, judged her too dangerous to leave free while the country fought for survival. For a woman who had been, a decade earlier, the most envied beauty in England, the descent was total. The doors that had closed when she left Brian Guinness for Mosley were now replaced by an actual prison door, locked from the outside. The role of Winston Churchill in this episode is the detail that gives the title its sting, and it is more tangled than a simple slogan can convey. Churchill, who became Prime Minister in May of 1940, was connected to the Mitfords by family, for his wife's sister was the mother of Esmond Romilly, the young communist who had eloped with Jessica. He knew the family. He was aware of the Mosley case at the highest level. The detentions under Regulation 18B were a matter of government policy for which his administration was responsible, and the most prominent cases, the Mosleys above all, reached his attention. It is accurate in substance to say that Diana was jailed under a Churchill government and that Churchill was personally engaged with the question of the Mosleys' detention. And it was Churchill, too, who later intervened on the human side of the case, for it was after his personal involvement that the imprisoned Mosley husbands were permitted to join their wives. That intervention produced one of the strangest domestic arrangements in the history of British imprisonment. In December of 1941, after representations and after Churchill's involvement, Sir Oswald Mosley was allowed to join Diana within Holloway, and the couple were given the use of a small house in the prison grounds. There, behind the walls, the two of them set up a curious married life. They had their quarters. They were together. Diana, who had a gift for making the best of any situation with unshakable composure, even cultivated a small garden in the prison yard, growing vegetables and, by some accounts, strawberries, within the walls of Holloway. It is an image that captures her entirely, the fascist beauty, imprisoned without trial in the middle of a world war, calmly growing strawberries in a prison yard and regretting nothing. She spent 3 years and more in confinement, from June of 1940 until November of 1943. The conditions were hard, particularly at first, the early imprisonment in a damp cell taking a toll on her health. She was separated, for long stretches, from her children, including the newborn she had been forced to leave. She endured it with the same iron calm she brought to everything, and she emerged from it not chastened, but if anything, more fixed in her loyalties, more certain that she and her husband had been martyred for their beliefs. The prison did not break Diana Mosley. Very little ever did. It confirmed her in the conviction that the world was against them and that they were right to defy it, a conviction she would carry, unaltered, into half a century of exile. The release, when it came in November of 1943, was itself controversial. The Mosleys were let out on grounds of Oswald's failing health, and the decision provoked public anger, for the couple were widely loathed and the war was far from won. They were placed under house arrest for the remainder of the conflict, their movements restricted, their passports withheld for years afterward. But they were free of the prison, together, and alive. And for Diana, that was enough to build the rest of a life upon. The wider story of Defence Regulation 18B is worth understanding, because it places Diana's imprisonment in its proper and troubling context. The regulation gave the government the power to detain, without charge or trial, anyone judged a threat to national security, and in the desperate months of 1940, with invasion feared at any moment, that power was used to lock up hundreds of people, fascists chiefly, but also others who fell under suspicion. It was a genuine suspension of one of the oldest principles of English liberty, the principle that a person cannot be imprisoned without due process, and it was justified by an emergency that was entirely real. Most of those detained were eventually released. Some were held for years. The Mosleys were the most famous of all the detainees, and their case became, for those who worried about such things, a test of how far a free country could go in suspending its own freedoms to defend itself, and for those who hated the Mosleys, simply a satisfaction. The conditions of Diana's early imprisonment were genuinely harsh, and she suffered for them. She was held, at first, in a damp and comfortless cell, separated from her newborn and her other children, with little certainty about how long the ordeal would last. Her health declined under the strain. The contrast with the life she had known, the houses and the servants, and the easy abundance of the Guinness years could hardly have been more brutal, and a lesser will might have broken under it. Diana's did not. She organised her days, kept her dignity, and waited, sustained by the conviction that she and her husband were martyrs to a cause that history would vindicate, a conviction that the imprisonment, far from shaking, only hardened. The arrangement that followed Churchill's intervention turned the prison into a strange domestic tableau that has fascinated observers ever since. Once Mosley was permitted to join her, the couple were given quarters within the prison grounds, and there, behind the high walls of Holloway, they kept a kind of house. They had their rooms. They were together. And Diana, with the unshakable composure that defined her, cultivated a small patch of ground in the prison yard, growing vegetables and, by some accounts, strawberries within the walls of one of the country's grimmest prisons. The image is almost too perfect a summary of her character, the fascist beauty, imprisoned without trial in the middle of a world war, calmly tending a kitchen garden behind bars, serenely certain that the fault lay not in herself, but in a world that had failed to understand her. She had been the most beautiful girl in England, She had become a prisoner of the state, helped there by her own sister, held without trial through the darkest years of the war. And she had come through it with her devotion and her defiance entirely intact. Meanwhile, in the Hebrides and in the Shires, the rest of the family was enduring its own slow catastrophes. And the worst blow of all, the one that owed nothing to anyone's politics, was about to fall. Chapter 12. The Broken Girl Comes Home. The Unity who had returned to England was not the one who had left, but a brain-damaged stranger who had to be fed, watched, and cared for like a child. And the long years of her decline formed the quiet, grinding tragedy at the heart of the family's war. She was brought, eventually, to the family's most remote refuge, the island of Inchkenneth, a small green island in the Inner Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland that the Redesdales owned. There, away from the press and the public hostility, under the care chiefly of her mother, Unity lived out the diminished remainder of her life. The bullet was still in her brain. She suffered. She was difficult to manage. She was prone to distress. And the woman who looked after her, day after day, was the same mother whose own sympathies for Germany had been part of the atmosphere in which Unity's catastrophe had grown. It is hard to imagine the weight that fell on Lady Redesdale in those years. She had borne 7 children. One son was away at the war. One daughter was a communist in America. One daughter had married the head of British fascism and was now imprisoned without trial. And one daughter had shot herself for love of Hitler and come home a wreck, to be nursed, in effect, back into childhood. The mother who had run her household on theories of health and economy now spent her days tending a grown daughter with a bullet in her brain, on a windswept island at the edge of the country, while the world the family had helped to inflame burned on. The marriage to Lord Redesdale, already strained past mending by the family's political divisions, effectively ended in these years, the parents living increasingly apart, the father unable to bear what the mother could not abandon. The family as a whole was now scattered to the points of the compass and to the poles of belief. Diana was in Holloway. Unity was on Inchkenneth, lost to herself. Jessica was in the United States, having made her life there with Esmond, on the communist, anti-fascist side of everything her imprisoned and broken sisters stood for. Nancy was in London, working, writing, carrying her secret. Pamela kept to the country. Deborah, the youngest, was beginning her own adult life. The sisters who had finished one another's sentences in private languages now communicated, when they communicated at all, across gulfs of ideology, geography, and unspoken injury. The schoolroom was a memory. The century they had divided between them had come, in the form of the war, to collect what it was owed. And then came the blow that no politics could explain and no ideology could be blamed for. Tom Mitford, the only son, the beloved brother who had moved among his warring sisters and kept the peace, was a serving soldier. He had fought in the war, and in the closing stages of it, in the spring of 1945, he was killed in action far from home, in Burma, in the war against Japan. He was 35. Of all the family's losses in those years, his was the one that struck without ambiguity or blame. The simple, total grief of a young man killed in a war. The sisters, divided in almost everything, were united in mourning him. He had been the one fixed point among them, the brother loved equally by the fascist and the communist, the prisoner and the Duchess-to-be. His death removed the family's still centre at the very moment it most needed one. By the war's end, then, the Mitfords had been reduced and rearranged almost beyond recognition. The brother was dead. Unity was a living ruin on her island. Diana was emerging from prison into the loathing of her countrymen. Jessica was an ocean away, soon to suffer her own loss, for Esmond had been killed flying for the war effort in 1941, leaving her a widow in a foreign land. The parents' marriage was finished in all but name. The great closeness of the schoolroom, the love forged in that cold upstairs room, had been battered by ideology, imprisonment, betrayal, and death. And yet, remarkably, it had not entirely died. Threads of it survived. The sisters still wrote, still cared, still felt the old pull, even across everything that divided them. That stubborn survival of love, amid so much wreckage, is the thing that lifts the Mitford story out of mere sensation and into something like tragedy. The death of Tom deserves to be dwelt on, because it is the still point around which the family's grief gathers, the loss that no ideology can be made to explain. He had been, throughout the years of division, the one who held. Loved by the fascist sisters and the communist sister alike, trusted by all of them. He had moved among the warring factions of his own family as a kind of peacemaker, the brother who could sit with anyone, who refused to take sides in the great quarrel, who kept the lines of affection open across the deepest divides. His own politics were complicated and have been argued over, but his place in the family was simple. He was the centre, and he was beloved. When the news came, in the spring of 1945, that he had been killed fighting in the war against Japan, in the jungles of Burma, far from everything he had known, the family lost not only a son and a brother, but the one figure who had bound the rest of them together. He was 35. His death, coming as the war in Europe was ending, fell on a family already stretched to breaking. Diana was newly out of prison and into the loathing of her countrymen. Unity was a ruin on her island. Jessica was across the ocean, herself a widow now, for Esmond had been lost flying for the war effort in 1941, going down over the North Sea and never being found. The parents' marriage was over in all but name, the father retreating into bitter isolation, the mother bound to the care of her broken daughter. Into this gathered grief came the loss of Tom, and there was no consolation in it, no cause to blame, only the plain, total sorrow of a young man killed in a war that the passions of his own family had, in their small way, helped to bring about. And yet, even at this lowest point, the thing that refused to die was the love. The sisters mourned Tom together across all their divisions. The bonds of the schoolroom, battered by ideology and imprisonment and betrayal, and now by death, still held, frayed but unbroken. They still wrote to one another. They still cared. The communist mourned beside the fascist, the novelist beside the Duchess to be, all of them united for once, in a grief that no politics could touch. It is this stubborn survival of love amid so much wreckage that lifts the Mitford story above mere sensation and gives it the weight of genuine tragedy, the sense of something precious being tested, almost to destruction, and somehow enduring. The family had reached its lowest point. What remained was the long aftermath, the slow accounting of what the century had done to 6 girls from one schoolroom, and the question of what, in the end, would survive. Chapter 13. The Death on the Island. On a remote Hebridean island, the bullet Unity had carried for 9 years finally finished the work it had begun on a bench in Munich. She lived on at Inchkenneth and in the family's care through the second half of the 1940s, a shadow of the formidable girl she had been. Her days a round of small routines and sudden distresses, her mother and the household tending her as one tends a sick child. The war ended. The world began to put itself back together. And Unity, who had wanted only to belong to a world that had now been destroyed in fire and rubble, lingered on in the grey aftermath, a relic of a cause that had ended in the worst catastrophe in human history. The damage in her brain was never going to leave her in peace. The bullet sat where no surgeon could reach it, and around it, the tissue of her brain remained inflamed and vulnerable. In the spring of 1948, the long-delayed consequence arrived. The old wound flared into a fatal infection, a meningitis caused by the swelling around the bullet she had carried since that Sunday afternoon in 1939. She was taken from the island to the mainland, to the hospital at Oban, and there, on the 28th of May, 1948, Unity Valkyrie Mitford died. She was 33 years old. The girl conceived in a town called Swastika, given the middle name Valkyrie, who had hunted a dictator across a continent and caught him, was the first of the 6 sisters to die, killed at last, 9 years late, by the gift he had given her. Her death closed the most extreme and the most pitiable of the 6 lives. There is a temptation, in telling Unity's story, to make of her either a monster or a victim, and she was, uncomfortably, something of both. She had embraced an evil cause with her whole heart, involved herself in its cruelties, and recorded no remorse. She had also been, in some sense, a casualty of her own temperament and her own time, a young woman with a desperate need for total devotion who found, in the worst possible object, something large enough to fill it. The bullet she fired into her own head on the day her 2 worlds went to war was the act of someone who could see no way to live divided, and who chose, rather than choose, to try to die. That she failed even at that, and lived 9 more years as a ruin, is the final cruelty of a life full of them. The family grieved her as families do, complicatedly. She had been, for all her strangeness, one of them, a sister loved in the schoolroom before she was a follower of Hitler in Munich. Jessica, the communist sister who had shared a bedroom and a drawn line with her, mourned the girl she had once been, even as she condemned everything Unity had become. The love and the horror sat together, unresolved, as they so often did among the Mitfords. Unity was buried, and the first gap appeared in the row of 6, and the family that had divided the century was, from that point, a family with a death in it that no one quite knew how to mourn cleanly. What Unity left behind was not a body of work or a legacy of achievement, but a warning, and an image that has never lost its power. The English girl at the dictator's table, the pearl-handled pistol, the bench in the Englischer Garten, the bullet carried for 9 years. The island where she spent those last years has its own melancholy place in the story. Inchkenneth was a remote and beautiful refuge, a small green island off the western coast of Scotland that the family had acquired, reachable only by boat, cut off from the press and the public hostility that had pursued Unity since her return. It was, in a sense, the perfect place to hide a daughter the country despised, a private kingdom where the family's tragedy could be tended away from prying eyes. But it was also a kind of exile, a banishment to the very edge of the country for a young woman who had once dined at the centre of European power. The girl who had sat at the dictator's table in Munich ended her days on a wind-swept Hebridean island, cared for by her mother, visited by her sisters when they could come, watched over by the few who still loved her, waiting for the wound in her brain to finish what the war had started. Her decline was not gentle. The brain injury left her changed in ways that were painful for everyone around her, her behaviour unpredictable, her moods volatile, her old fierce will surfacing now in distress and confusion rather than purpose. She was, by turns, childlike and difficult, present and absent, the ghost of the formidable sister inhabiting a body that had outlived the mind that once drove it. For Lady Riddesdale, the years of caring for her were a long penance. the more bitter because her own early sympathy for Germany had been part of the climate in which Unity's catastrophe had grown. The mother who had governed her household by theories of health now spent her days tending a daughter whose health could not be restored by any theory, on an island at the end of the world, while the marriage that had produced them both quietly died of the strain. When the end came, in the spring of 1948, it came as the doctors had always known it might. The bullet, lodged where no surgeon could safely reach it, had never ceased to be a danger, and the tissue around it at last gave way to a fatal infection. Unity was taken from the island to the hospital at Oban on the mainland, and there she died of meningitis caused by the swelling around the wound she had given herself nearly 9 years before. She was 33 years old. The pearl-handled pistol that Hitler had placed in her hand had finished its work at last. The gift of a dictator carried inside an English girl's skull for 9 slow years, fatal in the end as it had been meant, in that one terrible afternoon, to be. There was little public mourning. To a country still counting the cost of the war Unity's chosen cause had unleashed, her death was at best a footnote, and at worst a relief, the end of an embarrassment. The newspapers that had once devoured her doings noted her passing with little tenderness. But within the family, the grief was real and complicated. The grief of people who had loved a girl long before she became a follower of Hitler, who could remember the schoolroom and the dogs and the awkward, intense child she had been before Munich claimed her. They mourned not the woman who had sat at the dictator's table, but the sister they had lost twice, first to her terrible faith, and then to the bullet. And the second loss only completed what the first had begun. She was buried near the family's old Oxfordshire world, and the row of 6, unbroken since the schoolroom, had its first and saddest gap. Her story is the sharpest possible illustration of the family's central theme, the capacity of one upbringing to produce a devotion so total that it could end only in self-destruction. She had wanted to belong absolutely, and absolute belonging, given to such a cause, left no room for her to survive its defeat. The first of the sisters to die was the one who had run furthest toward the abyss, and who had, in the end, fallen all the way in. Chapter 14. The Unrepentant Beauty. Released from prison into a country that despised her, Diana chose exile over apology, and across more than half a century she never once took the apology back, because she never offered one to begin with. When the Mosleys came out of Holloway in 1943, and out of house arrest at the war's end, they faced a Britain that loathed them. The full horror of what the Nazi regime had done was now known. The camps had been opened. The scale of the murder was beyond denial. And here were Sir Oswald and Lady Mosley, who had marched under the fascist banner and married in Goebbels' drawing room with Hitler looking on, expecting somehow to resume a life in the country they had been willing to see remade in the dictator's image. It could not be done. The doors that had closed in the 1930s stayed closed, and this time they stayed closed forever. So the Mosleys left. They built their later life largely in France, settling outside Paris, in a house they called the Temple de la Gloire, a name whose irony seems to have escaped no one but possibly themselves. There, in a kind of gilded exile, Diana presided over a salon of sorts, received the few who would still receive them, and maintained, with the iron composure that had never deserted her, the conviction that she and her husband had been right, and the world wrong. She wrote her memoirs, a book of poised and elegant prose in which the regret a reader might look for is conspicuously absent. She gave interviews, late in her long life, in which she spoke of Hitler in terms of personal fondness that shocked her listeners, recalling his charm, his fascination, as though the intervening knowledge of his crimes had simply failed to reach her. She was clever, charming, cultivated, and entirely unrepentant, and the combination was, to many who encountered it, more chilling than any amount of crude fanaticism. It would be comfortable to dismiss Diana as simply deluded, but she was nothing of the kind. She was one of the most intelligent women of her generation, and her refusal to recant was not ignorance, but choice. She had decided, as a young woman, to give her loyalty to Mosley and his cause, and she had paid for that choice with her reputation, her first marriage, her liberty, and her place in her own country. Having paid so much, she would not, perhaps could not, admit that the whole of it had been a terrible mistake. To recant would have been to concede that the sacrifice had been not noble, but foolish, that the years in prison had been deserved, that the love of her life had led her into the service of evil. Her composure depended on never making that concession, and she never made it. She protected her devotion to the end, as fiercely as Unity had protected hers, though Diana, unlike Unity, found a way to live. She lived, in fact, a very long time. Oswald Mosley died in 1980. Diana lived on in France, growing old with her looks and her certainty intact, a figure from a vanished and infamous past who would not apologize for it. Interviewers sought her out as a relic, and she received them with grace and gave them nothing. Her sisters' deaths came one by one. The world she had known passed away around her. And still she remained, the beautiful Lady Mosley, the most notorious of the sisters, living proof that a person could pass through prison, disgrace, and exile, and come out the other side with their convictions perfectly preserved. She died in Paris on the 11th of August, 2003, at the age of 93. It was only after her death, and partly before it, as the official records were released, that the final cruelty of her story came fully into the light. Diana had believed, for most of her life, that she had been imprisoned by the impersonal state. The released files revealed that the case against her had been strengthened by testimony from within her own family, that her sister Nancy had been the best authority who described her as more dangerous than her husband. Diana, who had forgiven the state, who had even, in her way, forgiven the country that exiled her, had now to reckon with the knowledge that her own eldest sister had helped to put her behind those walls, and had smiled at her across the decades without ever saying so. The life she built in exile had a strange, mirrored elegance to it, a determined recreation of the gracious world she had been cast out of, conducted in a country that had not cast her out. The house outside Paris became a gathering place for those who would still come, and there were enough of them, writers, aesthetes, the curious and the unembarrassed, to sustain a kind of salon. Diana was a brilliant hostess, cultivated, witty, beautifully read, and her conversation, by all accounts, ranged across literature and art and gossip with the same easy command she had always possessed. To meet her socially in those decades was to encounter not a monster, but a charming and intelligent old lady, and that disjunction between the gracious surface and the unrepented past beneath it was precisely what so unsettled those who knew the whole story. Her memoirs, when she published them, displayed the same disjunction in print. They were written with grace and intelligence, full of vivid recollection and sharp observation, and almost entirely empty of the remorse a reader might reasonably expect. The years in Germany, the friendship with the dictator, the wedding in the propaganda minister's house, were recalled without apology, sometimes with a fondness that no amount of subsequent knowledge had dimmed. Late in her life, interviewed for radio and television as a relic of a vanished and infamous world, she spoke of Hitler in terms of personal warmth that shocked her listeners. recalling his charm and his fascination as though the camps and the murders belonged to some separate history that had nothing to do with the man she had known. It was not that she denied the crimes. It was that she seemed unable or unwilling to let them touch her memory of the man. And that refusal, in a woman so manifestly intelligent, was more chilling than any crude denial could have been. She outlived almost everyone. Mosley died in 1980, and Diana, the widow of British fascism, lived on for more than 2 further decades, growing old in Paris with her certainties undisturbed. One by one her sisters died, and one by one the obituaries rehearsed the family legend. And still Diana remained, the last great unrepentant figure of the 1930s, receiving visitors, writing letters, holding her line. She died in Paris in the summer of 2003 at the age of 93, having spent more than 60 years refusing to take back a single word. Of all the betrayals in a family full of them, this was the one that cut closest to the bone, and it was revealed, with terrible timing, near the very end of the long, unrepentant life of the most beautiful of the 6. Chapter 15. The Pen, the Secret, and the Sea. 2 sisters turned the wreckage of the family into books, one in Paris and one in California, and one of them died without ever confessing the thing she had done. Nancy, the eldest, made the more dazzling success of it. After the war, she moved to Paris, drawn by love for a Frenchman, the free French officer and de Gaulle aide, whose long, mostly unrequited claim on her heart shaped the rest of her life. And in Paris, she wrote the novels that made her name endure, comedies of English upper-class life drawn directly from the family that had formed her, in which the roaring father, the eccentric household, the warring sisters, and the cold schoolroom were transmuted into some of the most beloved comic fiction of the century. The books were affectionate, sparkling, and quietly merciless, and they fixed the Mitford legend in the public imagination as a delicious, eccentric comedy, which was both true and the most enormous evasion. For beneath the comedy, Nancy kept her secret. She had informed on Diana in 1940. She had supplied the judgment that helped keep her sister in prison. And she had never told. Through all the post-war decades, as she and Diana both lived in France, as they exchanged their witty letters and met and gossiped and played the parts of devoted sisters, Nancy said nothing. She wrote her funny books about the family and kept, inside herself, the one thing about the family that was not funny at all. There is something almost unbearable in the contrast. The public Nancy spinning the Mitfords into comic gold, the private Nancy guarding the memory of the gravest disloyalty any of them had committed. She carried it to her grave. Nancy died of a long and painful cancer, a form of Hodgkin's disease, near Versailles, on the 30th of June, 1973, at the age of 68, the secret still intact, the confession never made. Jessica, the communist, made her life and her second career across the ocean. Widowed when Esmond was killed flying in the war, she had remained in the United States, where she married again, to an American lawyer who shared her radical politics, and where she eventually found her true calling, not as a revolutionary, but as a writer and investigator. In 1963, she published the book that made her famous, an exposé of the American funeral industry and the ways it preyed on the grieving, a work of mordant, devastating journalism that became a bestseller and a classic of its kind and changed the way a nation thought about how it buried its dead. Jessica had taken the family's gift for total commitment and the family's gift for words and turned them, at last, to a purpose that did some good in the world. She remained a committed radical to the end, and she died in California in the summer of 1996, the rebel who had run from the schoolroom and made, of all the sisters, perhaps the most useful life. And there was Pamela, the second sister, the one the legend always struggles to place because she wanted no part of the legend. While her sisters embraced dictators and revolutions, wrote bestsellers, and married into prisons and palaces, Pamela kept hens, loved the country, married and divorced a brilliant and difficult physicist, and lived the second half of her life quietly in the company of an Italian horsewoman she loved. She was the sister who did not divide the century, who took the family temperament and turned it not toward any ideology, but toward a deep, unfashionable contentment with ordinary things. The poet who adored her had been right to call her the most rural of them. She outlasted most of her sisters, dying in 1994, and she left behind no scandal, no bestseller, and no betrayal. Only the memory of the one Mitford who had wanted, simply, to be left in peace, and who very nearly was. So the row of six thinned, sister by sister. Unity in 1948, Nancy in 1973, Pamela in 1994, Jessica in 1996, Diana in 2003. Each death closed a chapter of the impossible story, and each obituary rehearsed again the astonishing arithmetic of the family, the fascist and the communist, the prisoner and the novelist, the girl who shot herself for Hitler, and the sister who informed. The contrast between the two writing sisters tells its own story about the family. Nancy turned the Mitfords into comedy and became rich and celebrated for it, fixing in the public mind the image of the family as a delicious aristocratic farce. The roaring father, the private languages, the warring sisters, all of it polished into entertainment. It was a brilliant act of transformation and a profound act of concealment, for the comedy left out the prison, the bullet, the betrayal, and the secret she herself was keeping. Jessica, by contrast, turned her gifts outward, away from the family, toward the wrongs of the world, and used the Mitford talent for words and the Mitford appetite for a cause to expose and embarrass the powerful. Her book on the American funeral trade was an act of public service dressed as mordant comedy, and it did real good, changing laws and saving the grieving from exploitation. Two sisters, the same gift for prose, one turning it inward to gild the family legend, the other turning it outward to fight. It is as neat a division as any in their story. There is a particular poignancy in the fact that Nancy and Jessica, the satirist and the rebel, the two who had perhaps the sharpest minds of the six, both died of cancer in their respective exiles, Nancy near Versailles after years of pain, Jessica in California after a life of causes. Neither came home. Nancy had given her heart to France and to a Frenchman who never quite gave his back. Jessica had given hers to America and to the radical politics she never abandoned. The two cleverest sisters spent their last years far from the cold schoolroom that had made them, writing to the end, the one in comedy and the other in exposé, each having taken the family's strange inheritance and spent it in her own way. And through all of it, Pamela endured, the sister the legend forgets because she gave it nothing to feed on. While her sisters made headlines and history, Pamela kept her hens, tended her gardens, loved the country and the company she chose, and lived a long, quiet, contented life that asked for no biographer. She was, in the end, the proof that the Mitford temperament did not have to end in catastrophe, that the same blood that produced the fascist and the communist and the prisoner could also produce a woman who simply wanted to be left in peace, and very nearly was. By the turn of the new century, only one of the six was left, the youngest, the one who had refused to take part in the ideological civil war, who had married into a palace and outlived them all, and who would become, at the very end, the sole surviving keeper of everything the Mitfords had been. Chapter 16. the last sister standing. One sister married into a palace, restored it, outlived all the others, and became, by simple endurance, the keeper of the family's whole impossible story. Deborah, the youngest, called Debo, had watched the ideological wars of her elder sisters from the position of the child who came last, and she had drawn from the spectacle a quiet, lifelong determination to have nothing to do with any of it. While Unity worshipped Hitler, and Jessica dreamed of revolution, and Diana married into fascism, Deborah loved the country, the rituals of the old life, and, in time, a man who would give her one of the greatest houses in England. In 1941, she married Lord Andrew Cavendish, the younger son of the Duke of Devonshire. It was not, at first, a match that promised a palace, for Andrew was a second son. But his elder brother was killed in the war, and so, on the death of his father in 1950, Andrew became the 11th Duke of Devonshire, and Deborah, the Mitford who had stayed out of history, became its Duchess. The house was Chatsworth, the vast and famous seat of the Cavendish family in Derbyshire, one of the great treasure houses of England. And by the time Deborah came to it, the place was burdened by death duties and the neglect of the war years, its future in doubt. It was Deborah who, over the following decades, threw herself into the work of saving it. She restored it, reorganized it, opened it to the public, built up its farm shop and its gardens and its commercial life, and turned a faltering aristocratic relic into a thriving and beloved institution that drew visitors by the hundreds of thousands. Of all the sisters, she made the most conventional choice and the most enduring success. The one who refused the century's grand ideologies gave herself instead to the patient, practical work of preservation, and what she preserved still stands. The scale of what Deborah accomplished at Chatsworth is easy to underestimate, precisely because she made it look like good housekeeping rather than the rescue of a national treasure that it was. The house held one of the greatest private art collections in the country, accumulated over centuries by the Cavendish family, and by the middle of the 20th century, the whole inheritance was threatened by the crushing weight of death duties, the taxes levied on a great estate when its owner died. The sum demanded after the death of the 10th Duke was enormous, large enough to have broken the estate entirely, and it took decades of careful management, sales, and ingenuity to discharge it without destroying the thing itself. Deborah threw herself into the work with a practical genius that none of her famous sisters could have matched. She opened the house to the paying public, built up its restaurant and its farm shop, developed its gardens and its commercial life, and turned an aristocratic relic that might have crumbled into a thriving enterprise that drew visitors by the hundreds of thousands every year. The sister, who took no part in the ideologies of her century, quietly performed the most useful labor of any of them. And the proof of it is that the house still stands, full of its treasures, open to all who care to come. There is a lesson in that contrast that the family's louder dramas can obscure. The sisters who reached for the grand abstractions of the age, the new orders and the total faiths, left behind ruin, imprisonment, exile, and a bullet in a brain. The sister who reached for nothing grander than the saving of a single house and the keeping of a single family's memory left behind something whole, useful, and lasting. It is not a tidy moral, and it would be wrong to press it too hard, for Deborah had advantages of temperament and circumstance the others lacked. But it is there, in the record, for anyone who wishes to see it, the quiet vindication of the sister who declined to divide the century and chose instead to mend a small corner of it. She also became, as the others died, the family's memory. She wrote her own books, warm and clear-eyed memoirs of the family and the house, and she was sought out endlessly as the last living witness to the legend. She had a gift, which her fiercer sisters had lacked, for seeing the family plainly, with affection and without illusion. She had lived the whole of it. She had been the child at the table where, as she liked to recall, whenever the sisters sat down together to a meal, there was always someone present who was not speaking to someone else. She had loved a brother killed in Burma, a sister broken in Munich, a sister imprisoned in Holloway, a sister exiled to Paris, a sister self-exiled to California, and a sister who kept hens and wanted only quiet. She had outlived every one of them, and she carried the whole contradictory inheritance with a grace that suggested she had understood, better than any of them, what it had all amounted to. Deborah, Duchess of Devonshire, died on the 24th of September, 2014, at the age of 94. With her died the last of the 6 Mitford sisters, and the last living link to the schoolroom at Swinbrook, to the drawn line down the bedroom wall, to the lunches at the Osteria Bavaria and the wedding in Goebbels' drawing room and the bench in the Englischer Garten. The row of 6 was complete at last, all of them gone, and what they left behind was not a single legacy, but a question. The question their whole shared and shattered life had posed. How could one family, one upbringing, one cold upstairs room, produce such opposite extremes? And what does it say about the rest of the world that it could? For that is the truth the Mitfords reveal, and it is not a comfortable one. They were not freaks. They were the products of an ordinary English aristocratic childhood, raised by conventional parents on conventional principles, and from that ordinary beginning, they ran to every extreme the 20th century had to offer, and tore one another apart in the running. The membrane between the drawing room and the dictatorship turned out to be terribly thin. The same gift for total devotion that sent Unity to the dictator's table and Diana to the propaganda minister's drawing room could, in another sister, send a daughter to a Spanish war or a betrayal to a government office, and in yet another could simply tend a great house and keep the peace. The difference between them was not in their natures, which were strikingly alike, but only in the objects their natures fastened upon. And those objects were chosen, in the end, in the climate of an age that offered terrible certainties to anyone hungry enough to want one. What survives them is, fittingly, a vast body of words, for the Mitfords were inveterate writers, and above all, writers of letters. They wrote to one another across every divide their lives could throw up, across prison walls and oceans and ideologies, in the teasing, private idiom they had invented as children, and a great trove of that correspondence was eventually gathered and published. Letters between the 6 sisters that span most of a century. To read them is to watch the whole drama unfold in the sisters' own voices, the affection and the cruelty, the gossip and the grief, the way they could quarrel about the gravest matters in the language of the nursery. The letters are the truest monument the family left, more honest than Nancy's polished comedies and more intimate than any biography. And in them the central mystery of the Mitfords is laid out plainly for anyone to study. The mystery of how love and loyalty behave when history drives a wedge through the middle of a family. The wedge went deep. The love did not quite give way. Both facts are there, on the page, in their own hands. And there is Chatsworth, still standing, still full of its treasures, still open to the visitors Deborah brought through its doors. A great house, saved by the one sister who wanted nothing grander than to save it. There are the books, Nancy's novels, and Jessica's exposés, and Deborah's memoirs, still read. There is the legend itself, retold in biographies and dramas, endlessly fascinating to a public that has never tired of the family that contained the whole century's politics. The Mitfords have not been forgotten, and they will not be, because their story is not finally about 6 eccentric aristocrats at all. It is about how ordinary people, raised in ordinary love, can be pulled to the furthest extremes by the certainties of their time. And about what, of the love, survives the pulling? Whenever the sisters sat down together, the youngest of them remembered, there was always someone who was not speaking to someone else. It is as good an epitaph as the family will ever have, a comedy with a war inside it, a portrait of love that could not quite be killed by the worst that history could do to it. 6 girls, 1 cold schoolroom, and a century to divide between them. They divided it completely, and the dividing began, as it ended, on a quiet afternoon in a public garden in Munich, where a young Englishwoman sat down on a bench beside a small Greek temple, took out a pistol that a dictator had given her, and could not, in the end, find any way to live in a world where the 2 halves of her heart had gone to war. If this story moved you, subscribe and stay for the lives the history books keep in the footnotes, and tell me below, after everything the sisters did to one another, do you think Nancy was right to inform on her own sister? Or was that the deepest betrayal of all? I would love to know where you come down and where in the world you are watching from.